The outward corner. This is the edge that we are going to be stitching. This is what our final product is going to look like. Look at that beautiful corner. We're going to be doing some trimming and grading, cutting the seam allowance right down to that corner. As you can see, there's barely any seam allowance at the point, and that's how it has to be in order to have nice points. And there is reinforcement stitching right around the corner, as you can see, which we'll learn about in a second. Great. Now we need an inch of seam allowance on these two edges. And I cut the sample fabric so that if you snug up your pattern piece to the corner, you have just about 1 inch of seam allowance on either edge. So you don't have to do any cutting of seam allowance for this one. You're welcome. Yep, looking good. Now as we need to, we're flipping our pattern piece. Marking those notches. Bring our right sides together. And we don't need that many pins because these are straight lines, but we're going to hit our notches, of course, and then we'll add 2 other pins. All right, now we're ready to sew. We're going to start off with 3 stitches going forward, back stitch, moving right along. And when we get within a 1/2 inch of our point, we're going to stop stitching, switch to a 1 stitch length, and then we are going to use our wheel to manually move our needle forward so that we are in complete control. And we are going to move forward until we are just 1 stitch from the exact corner. And we lift our presser foot so we can see where we're at. That looks good. And we're going to lift our presser foot again, pivot our sample so that we are at a 45-degree angle from that corner. And then we're going to take probably 2 to 3 stitches on a 1 stitch length until we reach our other stitch line. Lift our presser foot, pivot, put our presser foot back down, and continue sewing that seam for a 1/2 inch on a 1 stitch length. Then we're going to switch to a 3 stitch length again and finish off our seam. Back stitching at the end of our sample. Now you can see the diagonal line across where that point is. Now for reinforcement's sake, we are going to stitch just the corner again because we have to clip away so much seam allowance. So we're just going to restitch that corner. So we're starting just a 1/2 inch from the corner on a 1 stitch length. And when we get a stitch away from the corner, we switch to hand turning the wheel. And we just walk across that corner at a diagonal, lift up our presser foot, pivot, stitch at a 1 stitch length for a 1/2 inch, switch back to a 3 stitch length, and finish up. And back stitch, and we're done with the reinforcement stitching. As you can see, it's right on the same line, but much sturdier now that we have 2 lines of stitching at a 1 stitch length. We are going to start by trimming our seam allowance, so cutting it in half. Then we're going to grade our seam allowance, so cutting the top layer in half to 1/4 inch. Then we are going to cut diagonally across that point right to the stitching. And then we're going to come at diagonals again to either side of the point, cutting through both layers of seam allowance. We need to reduce bulk in the corner so that when we turn it right side out, there's enough room for the seam allowance that still remains, and we get a nice crisp corner. Of course, we're going to press our stitching. We love pressing our stitching. Now we're going to turn our sample right side out, and we are going to use a tool called a point turner to push out our corner. You don't want to use scissors because you can very easily cut a hole in your fabric because they're very sharp. So now we're going to do our finger pressing of our seams. Use some steam to help with this. Now we're going to finger roll our fabric right to the edge so we have nice crisp seams. This corner is looking really nice. And when I'm happy with my sample, I will then apply pressure with the iron. Pressure and heat. And steam. There we have it. A gorgeous outward corner. A very sturdy outward corner.